was her name? Amy. Okay. Anything else? Yeah, Tom Benacosa had open heart surgery on Friday and is recovering. He had actually gone in to get some tests done on Monday, and then they scheduled his operation on Friday. So that's a pretty quick turnaround. Go home today? No. Room. Right. So Tom's still in ICU. Maybe get into a room maybe Monday or Tuesday. Anything else? Okay, if you would bow. Lord, we just ask that you, number one, guide us through our days. As we're going to talk about today, and we're going to see in some instances of stories that are from your word, Lord, we just ask that you watch over us and help us break what we might define as a sin cycle in our lives and around those around us. And we just ask that you help us to understand that either we're sinning or the people around us are sinning against us, or we're around people who are sinning. Lord, we just need to make sure that we're aware of what's going on in our lives and that we can become examples for you and for those around us, that we can bring light and encouragement to their life. Lord, we pray for all those who are struggling with health issues. We pray special prayers for those who were mentioned earlier, and we just ask that you watch over them and guide the hands that are tending to them. But we just ask that you direct the decisions that are made about their health, and we ask that you just, again, guide those who are serving their needs. Lord, we just ask that you watch over us and guide us, protect us through this day, and in Christ's name we pray. Amen. So in the first part of this video, hopefully you read this week. I mean, as a young man, this is one of my favorite books of the Bible. Why? It's all blood and gore. I mean, hey, go through, and what do you want to make a movie of? It's going to be the book of Judges, right? And you can see some of those instances where we'll talk about some things in just a minute, but we'll play the video and then go from there.
This is your story. This is my story. But most of all, this is the greatest story ever told. This is God's story. The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon replied, "but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." The Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon replied, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." The Lord answered, "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive."
Probably one of the hardest questions to answer is the why question. For example, why did the chicken cross the road? Well, there's been several people who have offered up suggestions. The most common, to get to the other side. How about Dr. Seuss? Did the chicken cross the road? Did he cross it with a toad? Yes, the chicken crossed the road, but why it crossed, I've not been told. How about Grandpa? In my day, we didn't ask why the chicken crossed the road. Someone told us that the chicken crossed the road, and that was good enough for us. How about Sigmund Freud? The fact that you're all concerned about the chicken crossing the road reveals your underlying sexual insecurity. Albert Einstein. Did the chicken cross the road, or did the road move beneath the chicken? The Bible. And God came down from the heavens and said to the chicken, Thou shalt cross the road. And the chicken crossed the road, and there was much rejoicing. But my favorite is the West Texan. To prove to the armadillo that it can be done. Now, if you're not familiar with the armadillo, it really has a rough time getting across the road. When it gets scared from the sound of an oncoming car, it jumps straight up in the air. Not exactly the right direction to go in this circumstance. Now, one day an angel visits a farmer named Gideon and says to him, The Lord is with you, mighty warrior. Gideon is puzzled by the comment and asks the why question. He replies, But sir, I suppose that's a polite way to talk to an angel. If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our fathers told us about when they said, Did not the Lord bring us out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and has put us in the hands of Midian. From a lower story perspective, it looked like God had worked miraculously to get them into the land of Canaan and has now deserted them. What is Gideon talking about? Well, a pagan people called the Midianites oppressed Israel now for 7 years. As a matter of fact, when the angel came to visit Gideon, he was hiding in a wine press to thresh the wheat so the Midians didn't come and steal it like a bully who snatches an innocent kid's lunch money. This has been going on now for 7 years, and Gideon was asking the why question of the Lord. This wasn't the only time Israel had been oppressed since they occupied the land of Canaan. Over a period of 330 years, they were oppressed by one of the surrounding pagan nations, the Mesopotamians for 8 years, the Moabites for 18 years, the Canaanites for 20 years, the Midianites for 7 years, the Ammonites for 18 years, the Philistines for 40 years, for a total of 111 years. Gideon, and I'm sure many others in Israel, assumed that God had abandoned them for no good reason. But this is now not how God saw it from the upper story. Here's the real answer to the why question. 30 years before Israel took possession of the land, God came to Moses and gave him a song to write down to teach to the nation of Israel. Write down for yourself this song and teach it to the Israelites and have them sing it, so that it may be a witness for me against them. When I have brought them into the land flowing with milk and honey, the land I promised on oath to their forefathers, and when they eat their fill and thrive, they will turn to other gods and worship them, rejecting me and breaking my covenant. And when many disasters and difficulties come upon them, this song will testify against them, because it will not be forgotten by their descendants. I know what they are disposed to do. Even before I bring them into the land, I promised them on oath. So Moses wrote down this song that day and taught it to the Israelites. The truthful answer to the why question is simple. Israel is experiencing oppression from the surrounding pagan peoples because they didn't keep up to their end of Moses' covenant. From the upper story, God knew that they couldn't or they wouldn't do their part. Under Joshua's leadership, they did great, but this is what we learn in chapter 8. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who neither knew the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Israel is a major part of God's upper story plan. Through them, he is going to reveal his presence, his power, and his plan to get all people back. But over and over again, we are told that they did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Israel is massively distorting the identity of God and how beautiful life works when God is at the center of our lives. God forewarned them that he would be obligated to discipline them, or at least remove his hand of protection from them. This is why they are in the trouble they are in. All 6 times that this happens, we see a pattern, a cycle. First, Israel sins. Second, Israel is oppressed by the surrounding nation. God tells us that he was going to use this to test to see whether or not they would keep the way of God. Eventually, Israel would cry out to the Lord for help. They would eventually repent, acknowledge the error of their way. When this happened, God would raise up a judge to deliver them. Once delivered, the cycle will start all over again. This is why the angel was visiting Gideon. Gideon had been selected by God to deliver Israel from the oppression of the Midianites. When it dawns on the farmer Gideon that he's been chosen to be God's mighty warrior, he asks, "How can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." Well, as we've seen before with Abraham and Moses, God often selects the most unlikely candidate to accomplish his upper story plan. Why? So when it's accomplished, everyone will know that it was God and hopefully turn to him. But God is not done stacking the odds against his team. God told Gideon that the 32,000 available soldiers were too many. When they win, they might think that they did it in their own strength. So through a creative process of elimination, the entire army is reduced to 300. 300 soldiers to come up against the mighty Midians, whose camels alone could no more be counted than the sands of the seashore. And to make matters worse, God instructed Gideon to pass out jars of clay with torches in them and trumpets as their weapons of warfare. Well, the night came for the battle. The 300 soldiers surrounded the Midian camp, which sat in the valley. And all at once, under Gideon's command, they broke the jars of clay, exposing the light within, and then sounded their trumpets. The story tells us that the Midianites woke up and thought to themselves, if they have this many trumpeters, just think how many soldiers they have. And in desperation, they took each other's lives, and the Israelites were successful. Oh, one more thing. When they broke the jars of clay, Gideon had the men shout out, "The sword of Yahweh and of Gideon." Now there were no swords, but there was a lot of Yahweh. When the Midianites said, "No way, there is no way Israel could ever beat us," Israel said back, "Yahweh." Now why did the chicken cross the road? I'm not real sure. I'm more in line with Colonel Sanders' philosophy. What, I missed one? But I do know the answer to Gideon's why question, because the same is true of our lives today. As Christians, we get ourselves into all sorts of trouble because we want to live life the way we want, not God's way. We think in the lower story that God has abandoned us, turned his back on us. But in the upper story, God is waiting for us to return. His arms are wide open, saying, "I will take you back." That is what 1 John tells us. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just and will forgive us our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness. And just when others think we're down for the count and shake their heads and say, "No way," we look them straight in the eye and shout, "Yahweh."
Well, that's not exactly wrong. Hey, there we go. At least it wasn't a crazy, call collect thing. So in the stories in the Judges, I just want to ask, if you go through Judges, and again, we're going to spend some time talking about Gideon and about 5 different judges through this. The whole idea is that at some point there's enough sin going on with what's happening with the children of Israel that they are enslaved, they're held captive, or they're working for another entity. And at some point it gets so bad that they actually turn back to God and they plead for deliverance. All right? So what I'd like for you to do is turn first. We're going to look at Judges 3. Excuse me. And can anybody tell me the story about Big O? What did Big O do? Judges 3, verses 7 through 11. It can be a summary. He kills one of the kings, right? So again, you go through this idea that you have Joshua, you have Moses, then you have Joshua. Joshua dies. Then he has told all 12 of the tribes to go forth and take control of the land that God had promised you as a tribe. And in this situation, as they went out, they're having problems because they're involving themselves with the Philistines, the Canaanites, the Hivites. And during this time, Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who saved them. Okay, why is it important that they would have son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother? Who's the Caleb that we're talking about in this situation? Sorry? Yeah. So one of the original ones, and what did Caleb do? What did he come back and tell Moses? Hey, we can do this. And so again, you have a family history where you're going to go through, and you have people who are people of action, and you can see that. And we talked before when we were dealing earlier with some studies that we did that there is a cycle in it. It can start at any time in a generation, and then you can either feed that cycle where you get beneficial outcomes throughout the history or the legacy of your family, or you can get things that are offset. And we compared those to a couple of different families when we were talking before. The next story, I think, was one of my favorites when I was in high school growing up. Anybody ever heard of Ehud? Ehud was left-handed. What did it mean to be left-handed in the Bible? Because every time a left-handed person comes up, there's something going on with being left-handed. I'm sorry? The sinister, there was some idea that they weren't, no more, there was a little bit something different about them in some way. The fact that Ehud is, and again, if you're keeping up on some of the things that are going on miniseries and the Plus TV ideas, this is a story that's coming out where Ehud, they actually have this as a miniseries where he goes through and he's Eglon is the king of Moab, and again, if you remember from your history that we've been talking about before, where are the Moabites from? How did the Moabites exist from the promise of Abraham? Sorry, a lot of trivia today. Schools, we're in the middle of the, third 9 weeks, so I'm on fire these days. The Moabites, where did they come from? They're Moab, but they came from a relationship. They came from Lot, right? And how did Lot have descendants? Sodom and Gomorrah loses his wife, right? His daughters are with him. How does he get descendants? Incest. His daughters, right? He gets them in a cave, gets him drunk, and then the Moabites come from this lineage. So part of the promise of the descendants of Abraham. So you have these people that are there, and as Moabites, they are always fighting against the Israelites. And if you would, look down at verse 15. Again, the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and he gave them a deliverer, Ehud, the left-handed man, the son of Gera the Benjamite. And the Israelites sent him with tribute to Eglon, the king of Moab. And now Ehud made a double-edged sword about a cubit long. So number one, he fashioned a double-edged sword. He made the sword. And how long is it? Anybody remember what a cubit is? About 18 inches, okay? And it's something that you could hide on your hip. Well, if you go through security for whatever reason, and I've had to do security at ball games or you do security at an event, you assume that most people are going to be right-handed. So which side of their body are you looking for something? On their right side, okay? Or an opposite draw, right? So you're looking at hip area, that sort of thing. Well, again, Ehud's left-handed, so his opposite side is going to be his what side? his right side to draw a sword. So and it's good for him because now he can hide these things, all right? So as we're going through this story, what does he tell Eglon? Hey, I need to speak with you in secret. And then the king said to his attendants, leave us, and they all left. And then Ehud approached him while he was sitting alone in the upper room. I'm in verse 20. And he said, I have a message from God for you. And the king rose from the seat, and Ehud reached with his left hand and drew the sword with his right hand and plunged it into the king's belly. And the handle sank into the blade, and his bowels discharged, and Ehud did not pull the sword out, and the fat clothes were over it. And this is when Ehud went out to the porch, and he shut the doors of the upper room behind him and locked them. And so you have this king that's been slain, but the servants that are there, they're not really concerned that the king has locked himself in his chambers. They just assume that he is relieving himself and he needed to be alone. Kind of gives you an idea of what type of king and what type of person they were serving. But during that time, that allowed Ehud to escape. The thing that I really want to point out is if you skip down to verse 30, Ehud goes through and he summons the Israelites from the hill country, and then they go through and they take over Moab, basically. But in verse 30, I think it's very important that day Moab was made subject to Israel, and the land had peace for how many years? 80. If you remember in the video, he showed us a clip of all the different times that Israel was ruled, and the total was about 112 years. And as we're going through these stories of the judges are, again, usually 40. Most of them are 40-year spans. This one's actually an 80-year span. And it's an 80-year span because of the things and the way that he had set things up. And this, one of the greatest stories, I think, and I think it's going to be part of this Ehud story that's coming out for the TV series, is in verse 31. After Ehud came Shamar, the son of Anath, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad. He too saved Israel. What's an ox goad? Anybody? We use cattle prods today that are electric, right? Anybody? There's a prod is a stick that had it had some type of metal, or it had some type of rock that was attached to it, so you could actually control what was going on in those situations. So we're going to compare that with Simpson's story in just a minute. The next lady that we want to make sure we talk about is going through and talking about Deborah, and that her story begins in chapter 4. At the beginning, and again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and now that Ehud was dead, so the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, the king of Canaan. So again, we get this cycle of we're nearby all these places where people are believing in all these different gods, they're believing in the Baals, and I've set up these judges, and the judges come during these eras. So in verse 4, now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lavith, was leading Israel at the time. And she held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. So, again, if you think about this story that we're going through with the first several judges, everything's happened in the northern kingdom, basically in Ephraim, in that area. So she goes through, and in this idea that she has a person that she asks, and the person is Barak, and she asks him to go with her and fight against Sisera. And in verse 8, I believe, she asks for him to go, and then in verse 8, Barak says, if you go with me, I will go with you, but if you don't go with me, I won't go. And Deborah responds, certainly I will go with you, but because of the course you're taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera to the hands of a woman. So, can anybody help me with the rest of this story? Because he really didn't mention it in the video. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Jail, uh-huh. So Sisera is the general who's against those that Barak is leading, and Barak presses him, and he gets him to move, and Sisera gets out of his chariot. One of the unique things that's mentioned in here is you get a little bit of world history reference for those of you who are history buffs. Why is this iron chariot such a big deal? And you're going to see iron chariots again in another judge story in just a minute. Why is iron such a huge idea? It's strong. It was a brand new technology. So you had I think it was the Hittites and the Amorites. The Hittites, they had gone through and through metallurgy had come up with a stronger metal than brass. And they could load their chariots with iron, and on a battlefield in the open plains where they usually fought these engagements, they were still pretty reactive to changes in speeds and maneuvers, and they could actually make a huge difference on the battlefield. So the Israelites did not have access to any of this. It'd be a modern day idea of going through, and I mean, especially in the early part of the American West, where you had repeating rifles from the Civil War that were now applied to the nomadic tribes in the western frontier, where it kind of equaled out what was happening before. Those types of situations where they just didn't have that technology, they couldn't do anything about it. So if you pick up in verse 19 of chapter 4, Sisera is going through, and he comes to jail. In jail, he says, "I am thirsty. Please give me some water." She opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him up. "Stand by the doorway of the tent, and if someone comes by and asks you, 'Is there anyone in there?' you say no." Again, and just as was mentioned before, she goes through, and while he's asleep in deep slumber, she takes a tent peg and drives it through his temple. Okay? And then when Barak comes back through the city to looking for him, she says, "Hey, you need to come and see what has happened to Sisera." So, and then in that story, in that instance, she is fulfilling the prophecy that Deborah had gave to Barak at the beginning of his fight. And then you get the Song of Deborah, which goes through and talks about the different things that happened. And at the end of chapter 5, you have a sentence that's about 7 words, and that's in verse 31. And after you get through the Song of Deborah, and then the land had peace for 40 years. So you get this another 40-year cycle where there's peace, things are good. So we're relating this time of wandering in the wilderness and falling away to a time of being right and doing the things that we're supposed to, and then we have a time of peace. And then we get a point where we go back and we're sinning, and we're in this continuous cycle just over and over again. So the next judge I want to talk about is Gideon. And he talked a lot about Gideon's first part of Gideon's story and the Mennonites, and I want to take just a second. I want to focus on the second part of Gideon's story. So I would like for you to go through, and I want to skip to chapter 8 of Judges. Chapter 8 of Judges, and I want to be in verse 22. So Gideon had gone through, and he'd had this success, and in Gideon's household, the one thing that he had done from his father's house is he tore down the altar to the Baals and took down the Asherah pole, and he offered a sacrifice of the second bull, which was 7 years old. Anybody deal with cattle? So a 7-year-old bull, where are you at in the bull's life? About halfway, the prime of his life. He's not young. He's not so old that you're worried about him not doing what he's supposed to do. But a 7-year-old bull is kind of in their prime. They're that 7 to 10-year-old, and that's the best that they had to offer. So he goes and he offers this bull. At this point, Gideon has taken from his wanderings with going through, and he conquered the Midianites, and he finally ends up and has a confrontation with 2 other kings, and he takes care of them, and then he sets up this ephod. So anybody tell me about an ephod? Anybody remember what an ephod was, or the purpose of the ephod? It was a covering that a priest wore, and the setup from Moses and the tent, all right, the tabernacle, that ephod was only supposed to be worn by who? The high priest. So at this first, again, in chapter 8, verse 22, the Israelites said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson, because you have saved us from the hand of Midian." But Gideon, again, at this point, he's focused on God. He said, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." But here comes something from Gideon's past. I do have one request. Do what for me? What does Gideon ask of all the people? Bring me one what? One gold earring. Hey, y'all are good. Just bring me one gold earring. And in this way, you get Gideon back to this cycle. And they answered, "We'll be glad to give them to you." So he set out a garment, each of them, I'm in verse 25, each of them threw a ring from his plunder into it. And the weight of the gold rings he asked for came to 1,700 shekels, which is about 43 pounds worth of gold, is what I have a footnote in my Bible. I didn't do the conversions on that. I used to be a math teacher, but now that I'm not doing a whole lot of unit conversions and old units, I don't mess with that. Anybody else have anything different from about 43 pounds, 45 pounds? That's a lot of gold, right? It's not Fort Knox gold, but it would be nice to have, right? So then he constructs this ephod. And what is the purpose of constructing the ephod and putting it in his house or in his town? What is he asking the Israelites to do without actually verbally getting this as a record? What's he asking the Israelites? Worship an idol, really. I mean, here I've gone through and I've created this thing. It's not in the tabernacle. It's not in a place of holy. It's not with what is supposed to be according to what our fathers talked about. But I'm going to set up this ephod so that you can hang out with me. So when that happens, what becomes his name? What becomes Gideon's name? What do they start calling him? Jerubbaal. And you see that, they talk about it, and they also showed and fell in loyalty for the family of Jerubbaal, and that goes back to the point where he tore down the altar to Baal and sacrificed a bull and tore down the Asherah poles and used the Asherah poles to burn the bull before he left and went through and did the whole fleece thing, right? Which is what he talked about in the video. Okay, and so you have this name that he was given many years ago, but now even in the Bible, he's referred to as Jerubbaal. And there's going to be some things about that. But then you get this, and we're not going to talk a long time about this, but then you get his sons. So how many sons did Gideon have? Yeah, 72. He had 72. One Abimelech and one Jotham. They end up in the end against each other. And what Abimelech did, he went through and he killed the other 70 that were between. So Abimelech somewhere along the way, and he was the son of a slave of Gideon, and he went through and he got the citizens of Shechem to side with him, and then all the people of Shechem helped him get rid of his 70 brothers. That's a lot of brothers. That's a whole lot of brothers here. I mean, there's not 70 people in this room. So, again, I just encourage you to read that. I got a couple other things that I want to mention before we get done. This idea of Samson, we've all heard Samson stories. I was one of the flannel graph Samsonites, I got your hair, and then you hear all this stuff that's on TV or radio, and I always mess with my daughter sometimes. I said, Delilah's still on 107.9 on Friday nights. If you listen to that, you got to be careful. She's giving out wisdom. Samson's visions on the Philistines in chapter 15. Tell me something about Samson that might be a fact, interesting point that you've learned or you've experienced through your reading of the Bible. Tell me something about Samson besides his hair. He was a Nazirite, okay? So at some point he had taken this special vow that he was going to be, and his parents had given him over to the Lord's work for his life. Yeah. Strong, very strong, and the strong came from the strength of what? It was the length of his hair, but it came from the strength of God, right? And when his hair left him because he actually, turned away from God and turned to another individual for whatever he thought was the best thing in his life, that's when he was allowed to have his head shaved. What else about Samson? Bad taste in women, and especially his first wife, because we don't talk about his first wife, right? His first wife? Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. And she was actually who? Where did she come from? She was a Philistine, right? So here you have somebody who from birth was told by his parents that you had been given over to God for service. And what is one of the first things that he requests as a young man? He requests his father to go and get this Philistine woman for him to be his wife. And that causes all sorts of problems because now she goes through and tries to manipulate him in chapter 14, which is really a great story. Again, if you go through and you just take the book of Judges, if you started a film company today, you'd make millions of dollars, right? So his father went down, and I'm in chapter 14, verse 10. Now his father went down to see the woman, and there Samson held a feast, and it was customary for the young men, and when the people saw him, they chose 30 men to be his companions. What does that tell you about Samson, that somebody had to choose his companions? He might not have been very likable. He probably didn't have many friends, and they certainly weren't Philistines that he was being chosen from, right? I mean, those people were not his friends. Great story. You go through, Samson is on the road. What does he do? He kills a lion with his bare hands, and he comes back, and he actually takes some of the honey out of the lion when he comes back. And I'm an outdoor guy. That's kind of a neat story. After his wife then goes through and is a problem for him and was given to one of his companions that was chosen for him to be a friend, right? So mom and dad, they didn't think Samson was going to come back or do what was going on right in his family. So one of the ladies, and again, this is in the end of chapter 14, verse 20, Samson's wife was given to one of his companions who had attended him at the feast. So what does Samson do? And this is, I love to hunt and fish, so this is amazing to me. He goes and he gets 300 foxes. I trap. I have no idea how you catch 300 foxes, keep them alive, and then tie their tails. I mean, he's got to have some help going on, that or he's really good at catching a fox. But he goes through and he starts all these problems with the Philistines, and the Philistines are out to get him. And, basically after the fox story, he does one of the most manly things you could ever do in the Bible that gets talked about. David talks about it. Some of the minor prophets talk about it. All the Philistines come upon him. He takes the jawbone of a donkey and kills 1,000 of them. I mean, how do you do that? You don't do that unless God's on your side. I mean, that just didn't happen. And you talk about the supermen of the Bible and what they were doing for David in the future. Obviously, you have Samson's story right there with them. So we all know how Samson ends up dying, okay? And the other idea in this is that in his death, he killed more Philistines than he did in his life. Just keep that in the back of your mind. There's one question that I would actually like to go through and talk about. If we have about a minute and a half, so you'll have to be really, really fast. Based on what Gideon used as a fleece, do you use fleeces in life? Y'all wear a fleece? Yeah, you wear a fleece? I mean, I'll admit, last night I was at a banquet and they're rifling away firearms, and I'm like, man, let's flip a coin, see if I win this one. Oh, I didn't win that one. Okay. Is that a fleece? Probably so. Coaching ball, you go through, hey, if this happens, then this is going to happen. Well, sometimes it works out that way, and sometimes it doesn't. But The whole idea is if you'll go through and review Judges and think about what fleeces you might have in your own life, there'll be some things that ought to be able to help you break this cycle. And Scott and I were talking this right before class. The whole issue that we see in Judges is not just Israel. It happens in our life. It happens in my life. I mean, it'll happen in my life today. Something's going to happen that's going to make me, probably something on the road. I don't know why. Left-hand lane people driving slow, going through Tawny Town at 45 miles an hour when you know there's not a cop there on Sundays. I mean, don't put that, I guess, too late. That's probably out on YouTube now. But the whole idea is, where's that cycle and where's that trigger that's going through you? And if you go through Judges, there's a lot of examples that you can take from and abide from. So thank you for your time. We'll be into a little bit of Ruth and some stories from there next week.
Just out of curiosity, I looked it up. My concordance said that goal was 57 pounds.
57 pounds? I mean, if y'all bring me 57 pounds of gold, I'll take it. We'll spread it out. We'll try to work on that. Thank you.